HBO's biggest fantasy series ended up facing its hardest task toward the end of its run, and it failed to accomplish what it was expected to do, but it might not be too late for the franchise to fix it. HBO's best TV shows include multiple fantasy series, with the genre recently seeing many exciting shows emerge on streaming. The Witcher, The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, House of the Dragon, Percy Jackson and the Olympians, and many more have been part of this exciting new wave of genre shows. Each of those had to face hard tasks. For instance, all 4 of those mentioned shows are adaptations of highly popular novels and/or games. When adapting a fantasy franchise for the small screen, there will be big shoes to fill in most cases. Interestingly, doing that was not a problem for this 8-season HBO series. However, right at the end of its run, the show faced its hardest task. Sadly, despite having grown used to success, the HBO fantasy series failed to pass its final test. That show is none other than Game of Thrones, one of the best series of all time, and the show that served as the face of HBO for its long 8 seasons. Game of Thrones' hardest task was undoubtedly that of sticking its landing, as there were extremely high expectations for the show's ending after years of theories, as well as the show having outpaced the source material. Game of Thrones' final season changed how many view the entire show. Sadly, it did not work out. It is widely known that Game of Thrones Season 8 is quite controversial, with decisions like killing Daenerys Targaryen, having Bran Stark end up as the king of Westeros, and more not sitting well with the majority of fans. On Rotten Tomatoes, Game of Thrones Season 8 is the only season of the HBO fantasy series to earn the negative Rotten label, standing at a low 55% critic score. Audiences rated the show's final stretch of episodes even more harshly, giving Game of Thrones an abysmal 30% audience score. The most negative aspect of Game of Thrones' final season being so controversial is that it ended up souring the fans on the show as a whole. Before Season 8, the fantasy series was one of the most talked about shows in the world. In the years since its release, that is no longer the case. Game of Thrones might have defined fantasy TV forever, with impeccable games of politics, morally gray characters, and battle sequences that felt like something out of a movie, but its disappointing final season has redefined the show's public image. How HBO can make up for Game of Thrones' disappointing ending. Game of Thrones might have ended in 2019, but, 7 years later, there is still a way to fix the fact that the HBO fantasy series failed in its hardest task. 2 prequel spin-offs have been released so far, with both House of the Dragon and A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms finding global success, showing there is a path forward for the Game of Thrones franchise. The perfect next step for the universe is to focus on the Game of Thrones sequel shows that are in development, which book author George R. R. Martin revealed. At the 2025 Iceland Noir Festival, Martin said that there's a sequel or 2 in development. It was previously reported that a Game of Thrones sequel series focused on Jon Snow was in the works, though it was eventually shelved. There is a chance that the show could be brought back, with reports also suggesting that an Arya Stark sequel series could happen. No matter who it is focused on, having a Game of Thrones sequel series that course-corrects some of the franchise's controversial decisions and brings back beloved players would help Game of Thrones find new life years later.